Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History, as we look today at the beginning of the Great War, as they were not yet pessimistic enough to call it World War I before there had been others. Because throughout the 19th century, Europe, although increasingly powerful and militarized, managed to avoid a continent-wide war for 99 years after the defeat of Napoleon. Although there certainly were some small but important regional wars. Partly, this was because Europe's focus was aimed outwards. This was the great age of imperialism, when Europe conquered almost the entire world. Unfortunately, at least for them, some countries like Germany and Italy got into the race for colonies late, did not get nearly as many as Britain or France, and were jealous as a result. Furthermore, in the process of conquering the world, Europe had developed its old traditions of militarism, a glorification of the military, a focus on military power. Britain, by law, had a navy larger than the second and third largest navies in the world combined, bigger than Germany and America's fleets. Germany had the world's largest army. This was useful during the period of colonization, but with Africa and Asia divided up among the nations of Europe, and military service being a way, in many people's minds, to demonstrate their own honor and to win glory for their country. A generation of young men grew up, like Alexander the Great, weeping because there were no more worlds left to conquer. Europe also experienced a wave of nationalism in the 19th century. Nationalism could come in two forms. In established countries, it was a great pride in one's country and its traditions. The French, of course, had France to be proud of, and they were. Indeed, sometimes to the point of chauvinism and arrogance towards other countries. But other nations at least in the sense of ethnic groups, with common languages and cultures, but not a common government of their own, wanted to become states as well as nations. The Polish, perhaps, would have loved an independent Poland, their country having been carved up by its neighbors in the late 1700s. And this nationalism was a serious problem in some of Europe's empires, some of which contained peoples from many different and distinct ethnic nations. The most mixed of these was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ruled by Kaiser Franz. This encompassed about a dozen different ethnic groups, of which only two, the German-speaking Austrians and the Hungarians, had much power, the two having teamed up in the mid-1800s to rule over the rest. German nationalism was also an issue elsewhere, because in 1871, Germany had taken over an area in France known as Alsace-Lorraine, because the people there spoke German. And France had taken over this German-speaking area centuries before during the reign of Louis XIV. The Germans had wanted it back, and 1871 they got it in the Franco-Prussian War, something the French resented afterwards. The French wanting the land back and wanting revenge for losing the Franco-Prussian War. Finally, Europe had kept the peace for so long through the balance of power, a series of alliances, some known, some secret, that meant that if any country was attacked, half of Europe would go to defend it. And so with each country having a series of such alliances, any attack on any one was liable to draw most of Europe into the war, so no one dared attack his neighbor. At least no major countries did. There were some small wars in southeastern Europe, in the Balkan Peninsula. But this balance of power would be tipped over by the actions of one man. Gavrilo Princip was a student in Sarajevo, capital of the province of Bosnia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, one of many uneasy ethnic areas that wanted independence. Or at least independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Princip, though living in Bosnia, was not an ethnic Bosnian, but an ethnic Serb. And his hope, and that of many ethnic Serbs, was to carve off Bosnia and perhaps other territories from the Austro-Hungarian Empire to add them to a kingdom of Greater Serbia. And in 1914, Princip saw a chance to make a point, having learned that the heir to the throne of the Austrian Empire was coming to town. This was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a nephew to the emperor and next in line for the throne, who was taking a tour of the southern portion of his empire. And he actually wanted to give a bit more representation and self-government to the people there, but only to an extent. Full independence, he felt, should be prevented with whatever force it took. So on his visit to Sarajevo, he was riding through town in an open car when one of Princip's fellow nationalists, like him a member of a conspiracy called the Black Hand, threw a bomb at the Archduke's car. It exploded. The Archduke and his wife Sophia were not harmed, but some of their guards were. The others suggested he finish his tour early, but he said no, he would finish his tour. Afterwards, they said, let's go home. But he said no, he wished to visit the security guards in the hospital who had been wounded protecting him and his wife. On the way there, his driver took a wrong turn onto a back street of Sarajevo, and there, Gavrilo Princip, disappointed that he had missed his chance, now saw he could pull out his gun and shoot the Archduke and his wife through the heart, both dying almost instantly. Austria arrested Princip, of course, but blamed the neighboring country of Serbia, believing the Serbian government had a hand in this conspiracy to tear part of Austria-Hungary's empire off and join to Serbia. And in fact, some evidence suggests that at least some Serbian officials in their intelligence agency had been assisting the Black Hand. Austria then made a number of demands of Serbia, a very intrusive and insulting ultimatum, one designed to be so intrusive and insulting that Serbia would have to say no. Serbia actually gave in on almost every point, but did hold out on a single issue. And so Austria invaded Serbia, declaring war in July 1914. And then the alliances began to operate. Most of the world, possibly even Serbia, would probably be better off today had everyone else just let Austria take over Serbia. But it didn't work out that way. Because while Serbia is a small country, they had a big cousin. Serbia is a Slavic country. And there's a much larger Slavic country that has always viewed itself as the protector of its fellow Slavs, whether they want that protection or not. And so, when Serbia was invaded, Russia began to mobilize their forces, preparing to attack Austria, to defend their fellow Serbs. Now, when Austria was threatened, this meant that Austria's closest ally, who in fact had already promised Austria that should war come, they would support them, in what's sometimes called the blank check, prepared for war as well. That was the Empire of Germany, the Second Reich, ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II, began to prepare for war after Russia prepared for war against Germany. And threatened by Russia, Germany now invaded France. And this was because Germany had had a plan for a long time. Germans love plans. A plan known as the Schlieffen Plan, after Count Alfred von Schlieffen, who had devised it. The Germans assumed that if they ended up at war with one of their major neighbors, they would end up at war with both. Russia and France having an alliance the Germans were well aware of. The Germans believed, though, that of the two countries, France was the greater threat. It was their hope they could knock France out of the war quickly and before Russia could even fully mobilize. Then Germany could focus on their eastern front, hopefully not having to fight on both sides at once. But France had thought ahead and had fortified their border with Germany. But just north of France was a neutral country, who, while France had offered to fortify their border too, had said no, because that would compromise their neutrality. And so the back door into France was Belgium, which the Germans invaded on their way to France. And while Belgium was a neutral country, there was another country that had promised to always protect Belgium and maintain their neutrality. And this was a country, too, that was in principle allied with France, although the United Kingdom had wondered a bit if they really wanted to go and fight on the continent for France, but they had promised to protect Belgium as well. Plus, stories began to leak out of Belgium, of German atrocities, of Germans slaughtering civilians, burning down libraries and universities and churches, of Germans even taking the bayonets on their rifles, stabbing them through Belgian babies, roasting them over their campfires, and eating them. This, by the way, was not true, although the Germans did sometimes shoot civilians in retaliation for resistance attacks against them. There were some libraries and other cultural centers they did destroy, purely out of meanness towards the Belgians. They were not, however, actually eating Belgian babies. But the nationalism of the time was so great, the sense that other countries were barbarians, so pervasive that there were some people in Britain and elsewhere who believed the Germans might really do this. And so Britain declared war on Germany and began preparing to send their largest expeditionary force overseas since their invasion of Long Island during the Revolutionary War. Other countries joined too on both sides. The Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and Austro-Hungary, as did Bulgaria, both of whom had lost land to Serbia and other allied countries, including Russia, and wanted some of it back. And because these countries, Germany, Austria-Hungary, were in the center of Europe, at least, these countries were known as the Central Powers, arrayed against the Allies. Italy was also supposed to be one of these Central Powers, allied with Germany and Austria, but they decided to sit back a bit and see who would win. And after a couple of years, Italy ended up joining the Allies. Hoping to seize territory from Austria-Hungary, the two countries fought in the Alps. In one battle, artillery fire was so heavy that it blasted the top off the mountain, lowering its elevation by about 16 feet. Men who froze on the Alpine front are still occasionally discovered over a century afterwards as the glaciers melt, and bodies frozen in the ice are revealed. Japan also joined the Allies, hoping to maintain its friendship with Britain, a country it admired for being an island kingdom that had come to rule much of the world through industrialization and naval supremacy, things Japan had been working on very hard the past few decades. They also hoped to take over some of Germany's island colonies in the Pacific. At the time, the Great War was seen as great in the sense of huge, but also great in a way of being good, as a great adventure. A generation who felt there was no great task remaining before them suddenly rushed into the streets to dance and cheer and celebrate in the summer of 1914. That their time had come when they could fight for the glory of their country as their ancestors had done. Finally, there was a war for them. Thousands of young men volunteered for the armies of their nations, and Europe went to war cheering. Now, the Great War was characterized by the use of new technology, or the vast improvement of some older technology. Of these, the most important would be the machine gun, some of which by this point could fire 600 rounds per minute, which made it difficult for armies to attack one another. Even now, armies had planned to march across the field, overwhelm their enemies with superior force, as had worked against Napoleon, or for Napoleon, depending on your point of view. This had often failed in the Civil War, which many Europeans had observed, but learned very little from, apparently. And so as armies marched across the battlefield, machine guns opened fire, and those men who were not killed instantly dropped to the ground, pulled out the shovels, many were issued, and began digging little holes, foxholes they were called, to shelter from machine gun fire. Over time, these foxholes were connected, making trenches, which grew deeper and deeper, more and more elaborate, eventually stretching for hundreds of miles across the French and Belgian countryside, with the land between the trenches so cratered by artillery fire it looked like the surface of the moon, and was known as no man's land because no man could live there. And to try to deal with these trenches, other weapons were developed. Poison gas was fired into the trenches in hopes of choking out anyone in them. This could be fatal completely, as it destroyed your lungs. Perhaps you would cough them up in bloody chunks. Or it might leave your lungs damaged temporarily or permanently. It might blind you temporarily or permanently, or cause other damage if you breathed it in, or simply were exposed to these caustic chemicals. Gas masks, of course, were soon developed to deal with this, but it was a constant threat and a constant source of fear. To try to get over no man's land, tanks were developed by the British and later built by other powers about halfway through the war. The earliest tanks were slow. They tended to fall in holes and sometimes get stuck. But by the end of the war, tanks had become better, somewhat more important, and of course, in wars to come, tanks and other armored vehicles would be very, very important. To try to clear out the trenches, flamethrowers were developed. These, I'm not sure, played a huge role in winning any battle, but they terrorized soldiers at the time. The flamethrower operator was an obvious target. It was not unusual for units to give the flamethrower to the least popular member of the company. Airplanes were used for the first time in warfare, at first to just scout enemy positions from above, but eventually pilots, who often carried a pistol, began shooting their pistols at the pilots of enemy planes. They built machine guns into planes eventually, so they could fight each other in the air. Early on, some pilots or their navigators, many planes being two-man machines, the pilot or the navigator would carry a sack of grenades up in his lap and throw them overboard, becoming the first bombers. Later, small purpose-built bombs were built for use in the war. The Germans in particular used Zeppelins, large blimps, to scout and to bomb enemy positions and even bomb enemy cities. And they had machine guns mounted on them for defense against enemy planes. To destroy a Zeppelin, to be, as some called them, a balloon buster, was a real mark of pride for a pilot hoping to become an ace. U-boats, undersea boats, were very important to the German Navy. True, they had the second biggest navy on Earth, but the British Navy was about twice as big. Throughout the war, Germany's battleships only left port one time to fight the massive but ultimately inconclusive Battle of Jutland. Germany's U-boats would be how they would fight on or under the high seas. So trench warfare would develop into a stalemate, with battle lines rarely changing. As each side rushed over no man's land, hoping to get into enemy trenches, but often being killed before they got there, even if you got into an enemy trench. They were full of twists and turns, making it hard to fire all the way up or down one, so that men who did get into them could be isolated. There were communications trenches, linking the frontline trenches with trenches to the rear, so reinforcements could come forward easily. It was very hard to seize an enemy trench and keep it. In 1916 alone, over 2 million French, British, and German soldiers were killed just in the battles of Verdun and the Somme. Almost an entire generation of men that was wiped out, and the European nations took part in the war. Of course, trench warfare was mainly in the West. In the East, the land was too wide and too large for trenches. It was a much more mobile front. So the Eastern Front was a front with much more movement than the Western Front, although there certainly were trenches in the East. The decisive battle of the Eastern Front is considered to have come pretty early, the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914. The Russians split their army, hoping to trap and destroy the German army. But the Germans distracted one of those armies and then defeated the other, completely capturing it, forcing the other half to retreat. But the United States had no part of this. President Wilson did not want the United States getting involved. This was not our problem. America, he said, should maintain strict neutrality in both thought and deed.